Hello and welcome to In Summary. Today we'll be diving into a war that has dominated the headlines for nearly 2 years, the conflict between Israel and Gaza. From the devastating October the 7th attacks to Israel's ongoing military campaign, the humanitarian catastrophe inside Gaza and the repeated but fragile ceasefire talks, this war has reshaped the region and drawn in global powers. So here's everything you need to know in summary. The war between Israel and Gaza, triggered on October the 7th, 2023, has developed into a devastating conflict, marked by staggering loss of life, immense humanitarian suffering, and intense international scrutiny. Israel launched a widespread military campaign targeting Hamas following a brutal assault that left over 1,000 Israelis dead and numerous civilians abducted. Over nearly 2 years, Gaza has endured relentless bombardment, displacement, famine, and a collapse of essential services. On October the 7th, Hamas initiated a large-scale attack on southern Israel involving rocket barrages and armed incursions into civilian areas. The resulting violence killed approximately 1,200 Israelis and left more than 250 hostages taken into Gaza. In response, Israel declared war and launched an air and ground offensive aimed at dismantling Hamas's military and governance networks. Over the ensuing months, Israeli forces advanced from Gaza's north into Gaza City, eventually moving further south towards Rafah. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has deteriorated to catastrophic levels. Infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, bakeries and food stalls, have been decimated, and basic utilities, electricity, water, fuel have all vanished. The Gaza Strip now faces famine after a systematic blockade and bombardment that disrupted food supply chains and aid deliveries. According to Gaza's health ministry, more than 60,000 Palestinians have died since the conflict began, with a staggering number of injured between 145,000 and 156,000, reflecting the heavy civilian toll. Many deaths have occurred while civilians were seeking humanitarian aid. Figures recently released cite nearly 2,000 fatalities on or near aid distribution sites. Women and children are believed to make up over half of the casualties. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, and humanitarian organizations consider these figures credible despite Israeli criticism of the data's integrity. Israel's operations have evolved through multiple stages, an initial wave of airstrikes followed by ground invasions. Despite claims of having cleared Hamas strongholds, Israeli forces have encountered repeated re-infiltration and resistance, suggesting persistent tactics by Hamas. Meanwhile, mass displacements has shifted populations to ever more cramped and precarious locations, with nowhere safe remaining. Israeli forces report having killed thousands of militants, though analytic verification of those figures remains disputed. The hostage crisis sparked widespread protests within Israel, demanding resolution even at a high cost. Early efforts to reach hostage for prisoner exchanges resulted in brief pauses in fighting, but no lasting deal took hold. Efforts mediated by Egypt, Qatar and the United States in late 2023 and early 2025 yielded temporary ceasefire agreements, yet those collapsed quickly. As of mid-August, Hamas has signalled openness to a renewed US-backed truce proposal involving a 60-day ceasefire and phased hostage releases, though broader terms and mutual trust remain elusive. International legal bodies have become deeply involved. South Africa lodged a case at the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of genocide, prompting the ECJ to issue provisional orders to protect civilians and facilitate aid delivery. Simultaneously, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants in late 2024 for Israeli officials and leaders of Hamas, escalating diplomatic tensions. Some countries strongly support these actions, whilst others reject the jurisdiction or question the motive behind them. Outside Gaza, the conflict has had destabilising effects across the region. To the north, Hezbollah launched rocket and missile strikes on northern Israel, triggering Israeli retaliation and brief incursions into southern Lebanon. A US-mediated ceasefire in late 2024 de-escalated the front, though tensions remained high. In the Red Sea, Yemen's Houthis have targeted shipping and launched attacks toward Israel, citing solidarity with Gaza. These actions disrupted global trade and prompted US and UK strikes against Houthi targets. In the occupied West Bank, a spike in Israeli raids and settler violence has driven a parallel crisis of displacement and insecurity. In Israel, public confidence in the government has eroded as the war drags on without a comprehensive resolution. Families of hostages and war-weary citizens have organised mass protests demanding a ceasefire and new leadership. Hamas's governance in Gaza persists amid ruin, whilst Palestinian Authority in the West Bank remains marginalised. The most significant truce came in January 2025, when Israel and Hamas agreed to a phased deal that included humanitarian aid deliveries and limited pauses in hostilities. For a brief period, civilians in Gaza experienced respite. Yet by March 2025, the ceasefire collapsed after a major Israeli airstrike, dubbed Operation Might and Sword, killing hundreds in Gaza within hours. Fighting resumed with greater intensity as Israeli ground forces launched fresh assaults into northern and central Gaza. Each breakdown of negotiations deepened mistrust between the two sides and prolonged the suffering of civilians. Inside Israel, the war reshaped politics and society. At the outset, there was broad public support for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's campaign against Hamas. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, cracks appeared. Families of hostages accused the government of neglecting their loved ones, while protest movements swelled in Tel Aviv and other cities. Criticism also came from military veterans and former security officials who argued that the war lacked clear end goals and risked entangling Israel in a prolonged occupation of Gaza. Calls for Netanyahu's resignation grew louder, though his coalition, propped up by far-right ministers, remained intact. By August, Gaza's devastation was almost total. Over 70% of residential buildings were destroyed or damaged. Schools, mosques, and hospitals lay in ruins. Nearly the entire population was displaced at some point, with the majority forced into overcrowded shelters in southern Gaza. Famine warnings were issued by the United Nations, with images of malnourished children shocking the world. Diseases such as cholera and respiratory infections spread rapidly in unsanitary conditions. Humanitarian organisations describe the situation as the worst man-made disaster of the 21st century, yet aid delivery remained inconsistent and often subject to political bargaining. Global leaders attempted to intervene, with varying degrees of influence. Egypt played a central role in hosting ceasefire talks, often backed by Qatar and Turkey. The United States, whilst publicly supporting Israel's right to self-defense, pressed Netanyahu's government to scale back operations in Gaza and allow more aid deliveries. European governments were split, with some calling for sanctions on Israel, whilst others prioritised supporting its security. The United Nations Security Council convened multiple times, but resolutions were blocked by US. The diplomatic stalemate reflected the difficulty of balancing Israel's security concerns with the overwhelming humanitarian emergency. As the conflict stretched into its second year, questions mounted about what would follow if Israel succeeded in dismantling Hamas. Israeli leaders floated proposals for long-term military control, whilst others suggested an international peacekeeping force under UN or Arab League mandate. Palestinians, however, remain deeply sceptical of any solution that did not address broader issues of occupation, sovereignty, and the two-state solution. The lack of a clear post-war plan fueled fears that Gaza could descend into prolonged chaos, with power vacuums exploited by extremist groups. The Israel-Gaza war has transformed the Middle East in tragic and profound ways. What began as a single day of unprecedented violence has spiraled into a prolonged conflict marked by staggering civilian deaths, humanitarian collapse, political upheaval, and legal controversies. Efforts at ceasefire and negotiations have repeatedly faltered, leaving Gaza's population to endure one of the harshest humanitarian crises in modern memory. Regional spillover and domestic turmoil in Israel highlight the war's broader consequences, while the absence of a credible post-war vision casts doubt on the prospect for peace. Unless meaningful diplomatic breakthroughs occur, the war risks entrenching cycles of violence and suffering for years to come. If you liked this summary, like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.